We are already aware that incontinence of urine is such a disabling problem. Incontinence, or not being able to voluntarily control urine through the urinary passage, is a disabling phenomena at all age groups. Today we are talking about extraurethral incontinence, leakage of urine not through the urinary passage but through abnormal locations. There are individuals who would suffer leakage of urine not only through the urinary passage, which we continue to treat as urologists in both men and women at all age groups, but women also leak urine through the vagina. Leakage of urine through the vagina could happen because of an abnormal passage which develops from the urinary bladder or from the ureter, or sometimes even from the uterus. What actually happens around is something needs to be understood. So there's a possibility that women could leak urine through the vagina, which could happen through the urinary bladder or through the urethra if there could be any surgical injury, any post-operative injury, any kind of an injury which could have happened as a result of the disease process being completely fixed. It could also happen after a road traffic accident. It could happen after a cancer which has eroded into these organs, or it could happen possibly because of any kind of a disease process or radiation. So when we look at women leaking urine through the vagina, which is called as vesicovaginal fistula or urethrovaginal fistula or uretrovaginal fistula, that means through the normal urinary passage, somewhere a urine communication has happened into the vagina, and that happens to be an abnormal kind of an incontinence where you have really no control. So this could happen to women very young and very elderly. Some women continue to live for a very long time, and some women probably seek help early. Sadly, all women live on diapers, and diapers is not the best way of life, unfortunately, but they're forced to do so because either they have been treated once, twice, or they perhaps are living with a leakage of urine which they don't know where to go to. So incontinence of urine through the urinary passage is treatable and curable. Similarly, incontinence of urine through the extraurethral regions, namely in women from the vagina, coming either from the urethra or from the bladder or from the ureter, any of these can be treatable, can be curable. So why should we live on diapers as women who have got vesicovaginal fistula, who have got uretrovaginal fistula, and who have got uretrovaginal fistula? Men can also leak urine from an abnormal location rather than through the urinary passage. After radiation, after trauma, after road traffic accidents, and after prostate surgeries or abscesses and injuries in the perineum and in the pelvis, and which could be happening through the rectum, which could be called as a recto-urethral fistula, a fistula happening between the urethra and the motion passage, where a urine leaks in that direction, is called a recto-urethral fistula. And this can happen. This happens and people continue to suffer in agony for years and sometimes even for decades. I just saw a gentleman who underwent a prostate surgery approximately 7 years ago in a different city. He came in today morning and he actually leaking urine through the motion passage or rectum. Obviously, he passes some urine through the urinary passage too. He lives in the agony that when he sits around, his rectum is filled with urine and his urinary passage also leaks out. So these individuals are not unknown. So they suffer in agony because they don't know where to go to. And in reconstructive urology, which at the Kokilaben Dhirubhai Ambani Hospital, we look into reconstructing organs which are diseased. Reconstructive urology has been a challenging situation for people coming in from India, from abroad, where we look at urethroplasty or repair of urethra, at the same time repairing the rectourethral and the rectovaginal fistula. So women leaking urine from the vagina, women leaking urine through the rectum, or stools leaking abnormally between the urinary and the vaginal passage or the urethral passage. It's quite a communication which has gone wrong between these passages which actually run parallel. The urinary passage, the vagina, and the rectum are three different passages altogether in a woman anatomically. And any abnormal communication of the urinary passage into the vagina or urinary passage into the rectum actually has happened because of some disease process, some surgeries, some injuries, some adhesions and fixations. And these are curable. These women and these men would land up living with incontinence of urine, living with recto-urethral fistula, rectovaginal fistula, or vesicovaginal fistula. So fistula, an abnormal opening between two tracts which were not communicating with each other through the walls of those tracts, is something which is sad. Sometimes men and women also could be leaking urine through the perineum. through a hole somewhere in the region of the anal verge, in the region of the urethra, the region of the scrotum. And this is completely treatable and curable. So the awareness is missing on these aspects, because once they go through it, they continue to live with it. And these kind of fistulae, these kind of leakages sadly become a part of the way of life. So an awareness in reconstructive urology as such is missing in a complexity of the subject that we deal with at the Kokilaben Hospital and Department of Urology. We continue to do urethrovaginal fistula, where the urine is leaking through the urethra into the vagina. We did a vesicovaginal fistula today, where the leakage was happening from the bladder into the vagina. We are doing a girl who is only 14 years young, and she has a vesicovaginal fistula since birth. That means she was born with a vesicovaginal fistula, has always been leaking urine since she is born, and therefore on diapers. Women sometimes leak urine post-trauma, post-radiation, post-cancers through the rectum, through the rectovaginal fistula. So there are many reasons why we need to seek help of a reconstructive urologist who would look at somehow taking the urinary passage away from the leakages and bring the urine back to the urinary passage. Seal and heal those areas by reconstructive work where the rectum is separated. There are omental interpositions which are brought about, or gracilis flap which is brought about. So over the last 2 decades plus that I have been into reconstructive urology, it feels good to be able to repair these kind of difficult fistulae, to finally give them the hope that they were waiting and aiming for and were not getting it. So friends, vesicovaginal fistula, rectovaginal fistula, urethrovaginal fistula, uretrovaginal fistula, and in men, rectourethral fistula, where post-prostate surgery or post-trauma or post-injury or post-road traffic accident or post-bomb blast injuries, the leakage is happening between the urinary passage and the rectum, can completely be dismantled, repaired, give a chance to heal, and thereafter the passages and the tubes work in unison the way they have been working in the normal anatomy. So it's a wake-up call on awareness of incontinence of urine, where leakages can happen very abnormally compared to the normal anatomical locations where leakages happen only because of sphincteric issues, etc. There are people whose external urinary sphincters are very weak. It could be man, it could be a woman, and therefore the leak, even with a minimal amount of movement, which is getting up, sitting, getting up from the bed, changing postures. And these kind of leakages are more sphincteric, and they could be reinforced and strengthened by a sphincteric mechanism, which we continue to do. In women, we continue to do a pivovaginal sling and somehow repair them completely. So they get a cure where they're not wet, they're not living on diapers, they're not living in agony, shame, and distress, where they continue to leak urine out. So I think the awareness on incontinence of urine as such is growing, because we don't want to live with incontinence. We want to leave incontinence. And in that, extra urethral incontinence or leakage of urine, which is happening because the leakage happening is through a abnormal communication between the urinary passage and the vagina, or between the urinary passage and the rectum, something needs to be dismantled, treated, cured, and given a life which is so important, which actually has gone completely haywire. Thank you so much.